Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Sniper Elite 4 running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now the game is currently running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings. Now we're running the system with 16 gigabytes of RAM as well, and the chip is set to its stock 15 watt TDP. Now the game is currently running at a range that would be, I guess, playable if you were playing this on a old school console like a PlayStation 3 or an Xbox 360. A lot of games were getting this level of FPS, even up to like the PS4 era. You were getting a lot of games that were still running at 30 frames per second with dips down below that. So, I mean, the experience is playable for sure. I would not call this unplayable. It's just not a great experience, and overall, it isn't ideal. You'll see that the frame times are overall consistent, though there will be moments where there will be waves. In general, it's not an unpleasant experience, but it's definitely not the most ideal, and I would suggest you try to maybe squeeze out more performance than this. And one way you could try to do that is by raising the TDP. So let's take a look at what happens when we raise the TDP to 25 watts, which is the balanced preset in the AMD APU tuning utility, which I link down below in the description. Now at the 25 watt TDP, we start to get some more reasonable FPS here with 1% lows that are now in the mid 30s and averages that are in the low 40s. So overall, a very consistent experience, and it is actually a pretty enjoyable experience overall, and I think most people would find this to be more than enough to actually let them play the game comfortably. That being said, it might not be enough for everybody, and in certain situations it will drop down into the 30s, but in general it is going to be a very good experience. But if you're someone that's looking for high FPS, then you're definitely going to need to go more aggressive with the settings here. So what we can do is, of course, raise the TDP from 25 watts to 30 watts and see what that does to the performance overall. But I would overall recommend that you stick to the 25 watt TDP, as it's going to be the best balance of boost in performance without giving you too high a temperatures. And you can see that raising the TDP doesn't really net us too big of a gain. It's overall going to be a very similar experience to what we were getting at these 25 watt TDP, just with higher temperatures. So really overall, not a worthwhile gain in the slightest. And in general, I would probably just suggest that you stay away from the 30 watt TDP on most systems anyway. The only reason I show it is just because there are systems out there that can actually properly utilize it, but those kinds of systems are few and far between because of the fact that the 5500U is mostly in cheap systems, and one of the easiest ways for manufacturers to cheap out on construction on a laptop is to just put smaller cooling, because really the only way that cooling works properly is to put fans and to have more mass, and essentially the more mass is the heat sink. So a good way to drop the costs is essentially to just put a smaller heat sink on things. Now, if we drop things down to 720p, we get a very interesting situation here, because in general, the experience is going to be pretty much the same between the 15 watt TDP all the way up to the 30 watt TDP. So you're looking at it right now running at the 15 watt TDP, and in general, the averages that we're going to be seeing, while you see on the screen right now 60, in general, after playing it for a little while, it ended up being mostly around the 50s, sometimes going up to 60, but sometimes it would drop down, leveling off really around somewhere around the mid 50s, with 1% lows that would dip down into the high 30s to low 30s sometimes, depending on what was happening in the game. And in general, that was something that remained pretty consistent overall with all of the different TDP presets. So at 720p, you're actually going to get a lot of mileage out of just playing at the stock TDP, which is actually a pretty great scenario to be in. Now, there are definitely gains to be had by going up to the higher TDPs, mostly in the 1% lows. Really, it'll see a couple of FPS jump, but you are introducing more heat into the system, and the gains aren't substantial here. Really, overall, what ends up happening is that it just keeps the averages higher, because depending on what's happening in the game, sometimes it will drop down, and at the higher TDP settings, those drops are less frequent, but it's not a earth-shatteringly different level of performance. So if you can't hit the 25 watt TDP, it's perfectly fine, at least at 720p, because you could just play it at the stock setting, and you'll get get most of the performance already. The 25 watt TDP and the 30 watt TDP essentially only end up just leveling out the overall experience, just getting incrementally better. But it's one of those things where I think unless you were playing it for probably a prolonged amount of time and really just focused in on trying to find the differences between all of them, I really think you would probably struggle to see an overall difference in performance between all of them. You'll even see here that at the 30 watt TDP, well, one, we're not even actually hitting the full 30 watts, but at the 28 watts that it essentially just ends up hovering around, the gains are very minimal over where we were at before, and overall the experience is just going to feel practically identical. So I would really just recommend that overall you stick to 720p if you are looking to play the game at the stock setting and not even really worry about having to raise the TDP or anything like that. If you are capable of raising the TDP, you can try out 900p, but just know that the hit in the 1% lows is going to be pretty drastic in the sense that, I mean, we're at 720p and our 1% lows are still dropping into the 30s, even when we're pumping through 30 watts of heat. So with this much power going through and we're still not able to keep our 1% lows pretty much consistently out of the 30 range, at 900p, those lower 1% lows become a lot more apparent. Now, the averages remain good, so if you just want a high average and you don't really care too much about having to deal with 1% lows that drop frequently, then 900p is definitely an option, especially if you can actually go with the higher TDP settings. But I would overall recommend that you just stick to 720p for this game. But I can understand the resolution being a problem. The best workaround is essentially to just go with 900p, take the hit in terms of what it does to the FPS, and just be glad that you're not at 1080p and having to deal with what is essentially borderline playable experience. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.